Welcome to the Anglotopia Podcast, where we explore British history, culture, and travel. I'm your host, Jonathan Thomas. For many Americans, British film is one of the most important gateways into loving all things British. Before they've set foot in the country, they've walked through it via a screen. They've stood on the Yorkshire moors with the Brontes, followed Daniel Craig's Bond through the streets of London or the Highlands of Scotland, laughed at the absurdity of the British class system in a Richard Curtis comedy, or been swept up in the mud and drama of a period epic. British film doesn't just entertain, it creates the idea of Britain in the American imagination. But what actually makes British cinema distinctive? Why has it endured and captivated audiences on both sides of the Atlantic for a century? What does a British film scholar make of the complicated, fascinating relationship between Hollywood and the home of Shakespeare? So, my guest today is Spencer Murphy, assistant professor in media and communications at Coventry University, where he teaches and researches film theory and audience studies. Spencer's specialist fields includes cross-cultural analysis, post-colonial theory, and Southeast Asian cinema. What an interesting array of
That's an
subjects
array,
there.
isn't it? That's some strange things there, yes.
And he's also the founder of the Coventry East Asian Film Society. So he's a film scholar with a genuinely wide lens, which makes him the perfect person to help us think about what British film is, where it comes from, and why it matters. So, Spencer, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having. What an introduction that was, Jonathan. Yes, I hope I'll live up to that. But yes, I certainly love my film, and I love looking at it. Yeah, from all different cultural perspectives. So this, I'm delighted to be on talking to you about this particular subject.
Well, thank you for being here. So let's start at the beginning then. So before we dive into British film subjectively, tell us about your own journey into film studies and how you ended up teaching cinema and in academia.
I mean, to be honest, Jonathan, I wish I could say it was it was a lifelong dream of mine, and I'd worked, diligently towards it since I was a boy. It really wasn't. I've always loved movies, since I was as far back as I can remember, and I'm showing my age here, so. Being a kid of like the 80s, for me, it was pre-internet, it was videotapes, it was pre-Blockbuster. So it was kind of, what you'd call like the mums and pops corner stores of video. And film for me was a just a discovery all of the time. I knew I would watch anything and everything. It was something I did every single day in my life. And it wasn't until later on, I suppose, in my mid-20s, I was always quite knowledgeable about film at a conversational level, boring people. And then eventually I ended up, making the decision to do a master's degree in not film actually, but it was kind of visual culture. And I think that's a real distinction, I think, between the two. I was always interested in the kind of cultural element because when I grew up, I really loved Hong Kong movies like Bruce Lee um, and that was the side of film that interested me more than anything else, which was kind of how one culture looks at another culture and how film can educate us or miseducate us as well. And so it was, I kind of not, I wouldn't say I fell into it. I had to work very hard, but it was, I kind of ended up inside, film theory, doing a PhD and, but more so from the cultural aspect of the visual culture than what I would call kind of film studies background.
So yeah, film permeates our lives no matter where
100%.
no
Yeah.
matter where we grow up, and many Anglotopia fans don't know this, but I actually met my wife, Mrs. Anglotopia, on our first day of film school in Chicago.
Wow.
We didn't finish film school, but we finished our degrees elsewhere. But we both have a passion for the visual medium, so it's
Wow. Fantastic.
yeah. So I try to bring a filmic perspective to things. So I will see how. So Your research specialty is Southeast Asian cinema, particularly post 1997 Hong Kong. So you've conducted field research and you've interviewed leading figures in the industry. So how does that vantage point, looking at British culture from that perspective, look, and how is the for to give geographic context, Southeast Asian means Hong Kong and that
Sure.
area of
Yeah.
Asia,
Yeah.
and so that was obviously a British colony. So that those films probably have a very strong British influence. So how does all that look?
I mean,
So it's a very
100%.
complicated
That's
question.
yeah. No, no. But I think you've identified it in a nutshell. That's what fascinated me, about that particular area of the world, and the cinema from that area of the world was, the fact that it was a British colony, for many, many years. That watching Hong Kong films, I think I remember when I was young. I mean, I didn't know about the politics. Just watching the films was the fact that you had so many of the streets in Hong Kong, Chinese signs, but then it would have like, Royal Albert Street. And, and there would be like buses that looked like London bus. And it always fascinated me that what was this? And I remember my dad saying to me, oh, well, it's part of Britain. And I was like, what? That can't be so. Uh, so that, how I suppose different cultures sit next to one another, but then also how they represent one another. And the big thing for me was growing up was trying to understand why I was enjoying these films where you had these Chinese, um, or Southeast Asian heroes kicking the butts of predominantly white people, and usually white British people as well. They were the enemies, and somehow that connected with me as a kid. Really, I think it's to do with topics and areas I'm sure we're going to talk about today, about class and the complexities of British culture. Ironically, were being played out in these films coming out of that particular region. So for me, it was a massive interest, and then really interested in what happens to you know to people and to cinema when the colonizer, so to speak, well, not so to speak, the colonizer disappears, when they actually go, when they evacuate and leave it. What happens, you know, in a post 1997? What do people think? Do people miss the British? Are they, what happens? So for me, that was like a moment of real interest for me about what is retained and what did people love about that part of their own culture, be it the tea, the Yorkshire tea, or be it the street now, be it food, and what happened. So it was it was kind of the epitome for me of everything that I was interested in. I mean, not just that, of course, but it really was a focal point for me in terms of cinema and the power of cinema, to represent these stories.
Well, and that's a great segue into talking about culture. So let's start what sounds like a simple question, but probably isn't a simple question. What exactly is a British film? Because is it where the money comes from? Is it where it's shot? Is it who
Yeah.
made the movie? Is it the cast that is in it? So like the definition can get split very
Yeah.
quickly. So in your mind, what is a British film?
But Jonathan, I mean, you've started there with probably the most difficult question you could possibly imagine, because it's impossible, I think, to answer that as a broad stroke, because it's dependent upon the film, because you could have films that look very, 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 very British, with the aristocracy. However, they're not British at all. They're not in any way, shape, or form made, by British people, so to speak, in terms of where the money's coming from. So it's very, very, very difficult, because even if the money's coming from overseas, the film could still be very, very British, depending upon who's behind the film, and what the purpose of that film is who the audience for that film is. I mean, for me personally, what constitutes a British film is, in my own personal opinion, is definitely about the people who are, although the money's very important, but the people who are, behind the scenes and in front of the scenes as well. The actors, the writers, um, the production crew, all the people that form, the artistic vision of whatever this film is. And if they're predominantly British, um, then it's almost a discredit to the film in some ways to go, oh yes, but the money's come from Warner Brothers, or the money's come from, because you could level that at all sorts of even American films. I always think of David Lynch, who makes these Americana films, and most of his more recent films are funded from France. And no one would dream of saying, Mulholland Drive is a French film, but then it's such a complicated, but maybe people might actually, but it's such a complicated set of factors that I think have only got more complicated over particularly the last 20 years, certainly post 2000. It's become very, very complicated. And I think we've seen that even in nominations for things like BAFTAs, the British, equivalent of the Oscars. What constitutes a British film? It's a really, really difficult question.
It
So
is,
I've
and
dodged
as
the question, Jonathan. I've actually dodged that question. I hope you noticed. I'm trying to dodge it there. Yes.
it's okay. I didn't expect a detailed answer because, like you said, it's so complicated. And just yesterday when I was going through my notes and
Mm.
I went through my Plex library of all my British films I have. I have a British film category, and there's like 500 movies in there, and I've seen
Wow.
a lot of British films,
Yeah.
and there's so many I haven't seen, which we won't get into that discussion because you'll
Yeah.
be disappointed at the ones I haven't seen. Um, but like I was looking at my list of my favorite British films, and I'm going through it, and I'm like, well, wait, well, that's not quite British. I mean,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
like there's British actors in it, but the setting, and then like I'm like, is that one? That was definitely a Hollywood film,
Yeah.
but it's considered a British film. And so it's like again, like you get into the weeds, it gets very complicated. And I know, um, like for me, a British film, and I'm going to answer the question
Go on. No,
it,
please do. I'm fascinated. Yeah.
for me, and as somebody who wants to consume British content, a British film has either a setting or a
Mm.
cultural setting that is identifiably British. So if when Hollywood comes with a big check and hires people to make a British film, and they've hired a British production company and they've
Sure.
hired a British cast, to
Yeah.
me that feels authentically British. But then you, like you said, you get into the weeds when you think, oh, well, okay, one of my favorite films of all time is The Remains of the Day, a story that's so
Yeah.
uniquely British.
Yeah.
But those are Merchant Ivory films.
Sure.
Those are really a product of former British imperial subjects coming to Britain and making a period film. Like you get into the weeds like that, and I know that yeah. So that's my answer to the question.
Yeah. You're dodging it there. You're dodging it as well there, John. But I couldn't agree more. It's so difficult. And the minute, I mean, even myself, when I start thinking about, British film, and I'm sure you're the same with this, John, there's certain films that you just go, oh, yes, that's a British film. No question. No one's going to argue that this is a British film. And then there's other films where you go, oh, is it? Is it really?
Yeah.
Or it's difficult. It's very, very difficult.
Well, then you look at, and you can tell when Hollywood makes a British film and doesn't hire British people, or
Yes,
sets
yes,
it in
yes.
Britain
Yes.
and an American wrote the screenplay,
Sure.
or they cast American actors who try to do a
Sure.
British accent. And
Yeah.
you can tell those failures immediately just
Oh,
because
100%. Yeah.
but
I mean,
but
I always call it there's a measure for me. I think you've got uh, um, the measure in terms of British film. You have got that is kind of almost like the Mary Poppins test. It's like
yeah.
uh, um, a film that, I mean, Mary Poppins, of course, is not even shot in the UK, is it? But it's that test. It's kind of like, uh, and what was the film called as well? Three Men and a Little Lady, which had a sequence that moved to the UK, and it was all but I mean, those films, they're not. They're very British. There's a lot of British things in them, but they're not. They are they're a tourist. Vision who I have little doubt has never been to the UK. Their version of what the UK is, what Britain is to them, and unfortunately, you do keep. You see many examples of that, chocolate box kind of Britain, and even films with the best of intentions can kind of slip into that problematic representation.
Well, right, and like when the most popular British films over here would be like the Harry Potter films,
100%, yeah.
James Bond films,
Yes, yes, yes.
and those are 100% Hollywood money.
Oh, yeah.
And their vision, and even with the Harry Potter films, some of the directors were American or not even or
No, yeah,
Mexican, but now
yeah,
Alfonso Cuarón. So,
yeah, yeah,
like that
yeah,
was foreigners interpreting a vision of Britain that
yeah,
they think American audiences want to
yeah.
see, and yet those films are so beloved with Anglophiles, or even the Downton Abbey movies are funded by
100%. Yeah,
American money,
yeah, yeah.
and I was thinking about this and making my list. I'm like, one of the greatest films of all time is Lawrence of Arabia.
Mm, mm, mm.
Is that a British film? Because it's a British subject, but 90% of it takes place in a place that's not Britain. The subject
Sure,
matter is World War One,
sure.
which is a very British topic,
Of course.
but yet, but it was made by Hollywood money, so is
Yeah.
it British?
It's a very, very complicated, and it gets and just to I'm going to put another layer of complication on is then of course you have these representations of British culture. You mentioned Harry Potter, that then have an effect on British culture as well. So British cultural feel that they need to represent themselves in that way in order to meet the expectations of tourists, for example.
Yeah.
You've got villages in the UK who feel, I mean, there's a lovely place called Burton on the Water, which is a beautiful chocolate box village, and you go there, and you notice little shops selling Harry Potter things, and because they know that this is, the audience, the tourists who are coming over, you've got to kind of meet that, that expectation as well of what is expected, or therefore there's going to be disappointment. It's like I don't know, visiting China and going, this place is great, but where's Chinatown? It's that kind of. And I think there's an element of that. It can have an impact as well, which is kind of where it gets really mutated and problematic.
Well, and that's I never thought of it that way, that it's actually a two-way conversation.
Mm.
I never thought of it that way. See, I'm learning something. I should take your course. And you mentioned that these movies make an idea in our heads of what to expect when we go to Britain. And when I first went to Britain in 2001, pre 9/11, I should
Yeah, yeah.
emphasize, because the world was completely different then.
Sure, yeah. Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
um, you know, I was actually disappointed at first because London did not match what
No,
films and TV shows had prepared for
sure,
me. It
sure.
laid the groundwork. But I would argue with you, or agree with you, that in the last 25 years or so, London and, like you said, villages and places have adapted to cater to that. Like, think of the shambles in York. The whole street is Harry Potter stores and
Yeah,
tea shops, and that's what
yeah, yeah.
people want to see,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know?
100%. I mean, I think as you mentioned London as well, is it's, uh, the representation of it in the film, from an outsider's eyes, then has an impact on, on what that space becomes or has to become in order to meet it. And it's like a snake eating its tail. You know, it's like it's such a strange relationship. Um, I mean, and obviously, I mean that the Britain's not on its own in that, but it's a very very peculiar for Britain in particular. I think, given as you mentioned, the big kind of iconography of these films is around not even around history at the moment, for a contemporary audience. It's around, as you mentioned, Harry Potter, which I think is unquestionably the biggest export that British cinema, again, well, it's
Yeah,
problematic,
yeah,
has
yeah.
has has had, and to go to Disney World and walk around, Harry Potter land or whatever, and it's more British than Britain.
Well, and that's what's funny is in the discourse is everyone's talking about they're making a TV show on Harry Potter. And everyone's like, why are they making a TV show? They already did the movies. The
Sure.
movies are great. Why would they make a
Yeah.
TV show?
Yeah.
And all I can say is it's going to be the most popular television show on the planet. I
No
mean,
question.
it's gonna be bigger than Game of Thrones.
No question
No,
about it. Yeah.
I mean, even taking into consideration the discourse backlash against J.K. Rowling, most of the world does not care. It's going to be the most popular show ever, and I wonder how that will change the tourism landscape because even more people are going to be coming to Britain for that Harry Potter experience.
And also, I mean, what's really going to fascinate me about the new about the TV show is, and you touched on it earlier, is how they're going to shoot it, how they're going to film it. I mean, I saw obviously in the UK, you'll see, uh, um, images of them where they're filming it,
Yeah.
and and I'm fascinated about how they're going to film it because Britain has changed, and since the first one, and it's going to be fascinating how whether it's more gritty, whether it's more, I don't know. I'm fascinated how they're going to film it and how it's going to look and what approach they take to it.
Yeah, I've been wondering that since they announced the show because the visual language of Harry Potter
Mm.
is very distinctly rooted in Gothic and neo Gothic
Yeah, yeah,
look and feel, and I'm like, well,
yeah,
what are you going to do to do this all over again? Because that's what people are going to expect to see. But
yeah,
also, if you're creating something new, you want a new visual language,
yeah, yeah,
and I think I got my answer when they released the trailer and seeing the set pictures. A lot of people don't realize that even people who read the books that Harry Potter is actually a period piece. It's set in the
yeah,
90s.
yeah.
And so the new show is distinctly going to be set in the 90s. People are wearing
Okay.
90s
Yeah,
fashion.
yeah.
The cars are 90s because even though the movies started just after the 90s, they rooted them in
Mm,
the early 2000s. So the
mm,
look and
mm, mm,
feel is
mm,
very modern.
mhm.
So I think that's one way they're going to change the visual identity is
Right.
they're
Okay. Yeah.
very much rooting it in the 90s in cool Britannia.
Which is again a really clever. I think that's a really clever move as well, particularly when
Yeah.
you look at uh, um, the popularity of that kind of nostalgic, thinking of Stranger Things, is you've got, although it's very different, but you've got that, and to go to the 90s, I didn't realize that actually, but that's a very interesting aesthetic for them to touch on, particularly as you mentioned with that moment in British culture. But it's good. But again, as I've said, I think it will have no doubt at all that it's going to have an enormous impact on Britain and how it tries to represent itself, particularly to tourism, which is an enormous part of the British economy.
So we're 25 minutes in and we haven't defined what a
Really, I
British film
know this
is.
is, yes. Never mind. Yes.
So British cinema often has key genres that we kind of expect. There's social realism,
Yeah.
there's the heritage film,
Yeah.
there's kitchen sink drama,
Hmm.
there's slapstick British comedy,
Yeah.
or even sarcastic British comedy, the gangster film, and the spy thriller. Do
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
think these characterizations are accurate, or does it sort of flatten a more complex culture?
No, I think there's, I mean, of all those genres that you mentioned, I think that what British cinema has has managed to do with all of those is really add something, I think anyway, that's very distinctively British and British sensibilities into those genres. Even, I mean, I would add it's a big, area of love of mine would be the kind of hammer horror, of the way in which uh, um British cinema injected its own sense of identity into something that was, Dracula films or even Frankenstein films, going back to, Universal Pictures of the 20s and 30s in America, and gave it something very distinctly British. I think all of us, I wouldn't say that it flattens the culture, or but of course, there are always examples within all of those genres of films that do exactly that. That reduce the culture down and offer very bland representations of complex ideas. But then at the end of the day, that's what cinema from anywhere in the world tends to do. It has to offer recognizable stereotypes, for example, in order to communicate to the audience. But, there are films within all of those genres that are made for different audiences, because that's what I think's enormously important, is who are these films made for? Are they made for an international audience? Are they made to try and, you know, touch base beyond Britain, or are they British films that are made for British people?
So, following on from that, there's an argument that one of the most enduring qualities of British cinema is its relationship to class. That
Yes,
British films are almost always consciously or not about the class system. And if you
yes.
even look at Harry Potter films, class stratification is present. So, do you buy that? And why do you think Britain itself in its filmic enterprises is so obsessed with class when Americans just couldn't be bothered, even though we love class stories?
Because I think, I mean, yeah, I am completely preoccupied by class. I think class, in terms of British culture, heritage, history, is such a complex, um, convoluted set of unwritten rules. It's been mythologized as well, in literature, and it's so difficult, I think, even for British people to truly understand it, let alone, trying to communicate that out to a international audience. And I think the movies that are quite successful in trying to communicate how class operates historically within the UK are films that will do it in a quite explicit way. When I mean explicit, they will literally be what I would call upstairs, downstairs films, where you've got, be it Downtown Abbey or Remains of the or the Merchant Ivory films, where it's literally the aristocracy, live above ground, so to speak, do very little work. And the working people live underneath them and, serve the needs of those above them. And I think that class in the UK is not, which is a very difficult thing to get across in movies, is it's not that it's related purely to finance, to how much money you have. You could be a very, very wealthy working class person. You could be a millionaire and you'll always be working class. Um, and, that idea of class being embedded, generationally, that this is going back, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, middle class people who don't have a lot of money. And movies, articulate that struggle. And there is an enormous preoccupation, certainly, from, I would say, the 1960s, late 1960s, 70s, particularly the 80s, of British cinema really trying to represent class and class struggle, um, through narrative cinema, and we get wonderful examples of it that are quite contemporary as well, because a lot of the popular films that have certainly reached international audiences that relate to class are are invariably about things that happened 200 years ago. Downtown Abbey, obviously, being a very contemporary example, because it's a kind of safe space to talk about it as well, to go back and look at something from 200 years ago. But those films are, they're not historical documents, they are mythologies in and of themselves, about the struggle. But a lot of the popular figures of British cinema, the icons, I would say, are completely interconnected with class, be it Sherlock Holmes, be it Robin Hood, you know, all the way through to James Bond. That they are there's a distinct class struggle that goes on in those films. And I'm always heartened and delighted to see some films that are, I would argue, that are made predominantly for a British audience, that really represent, class and class problems and struggles, which are usually regional and dependent on area. Um, break out and reach international audiences. I think it's wonderful when that happens.
Yeah, and I could just off the top of my head examples, especially from the '90s, like the Full Monty, uh,
100%.
Billy Elliot,
Yeah,
and even and it's more subtle, but even in Richard Curtis's films, like
definitely.
Notting Hill and Bridget
Yeah,
Jones,
yeah,
and even Love Actually has
yeah.
class it's
It 100%. I mean, I think most British cinema, again, when we were talking, you were looking through your library of British movies. I was thinking about, British movies and thinking about the ones that really, connected with me when I was growing up, ones that have really stuck with me. And I can't think of any, well, maybe one or two that aren't about class, and about class struggle. And I think that for myself, at a personal level, coming from the kind of, an heavily industrial area of the UK in Birmingham, and a very particular area called the Black Country because of its, the filth of the industrial revolution that was there. Um, is class for me has been an enormous part of my growing up with my family, and then also, to then move into what a lot of people would call a very middle class kind of job, a lecturer working at university. But my accent, the way I speak, where I live, where I'm from, is working class, and it will never leave me. And people in Britain, I teach a lot of international students. It is, I try to show them movies which are, you know, distinctly working class and quite regional and things that won't have traveled very well, but to me, are quite universal in their messaging as well.
and I was gonna say, British people can immediately identify a lot about a fellow British person as soon as they open their mouth.
Oh, 100%.
You can immediately tell class, where you're from, and you can make lots of assumptions about a person, and that's not a great thing.
No,
At least especially from an American perspective, because, generally while you can make assumptions based on the way somebody speaks, often a lot of the times you can be wrong, and especially and we're getting off the rails here, but, in America, because of our entertainment, because of movies and TV shows, a lot of our accents have been flattened. So, like, I'm from the Midwest, our accent is very flat, and if you watch movies, you'll find that a lot of movies, the actors will sound like Midwesterners, but like Midwesterners, not upper Midwesterners,
right,
because
okay,
because
yeah,
then you get a unique accent the further north you go. So, but like it does has flattened the accent, so you actually can't really, especially with Hollywood actors, is you actually most of the time can't tell where they're from because they speak in a very
yeah,
flat accent. But
yeah,
it's
yeah.
not the case in Britain.
No. And that's one of the. I always think that's one of the most surprising things for um, people and tourists coming to the UK would be that literally you can drive 30 minutes for 45 minutes from where I live, and they have an entirely different accent. They use different words, and if you drive an hour or an hour and a half, then they may as well be speaking a different language altogether. Even I can't understand some things. Um, and I think that but again, I think in terms of cinema, um, you know, there was a struggle as decades went on for, if you go into the 1920s, 1930s, there was a Queen's English. There was one particular kind of accent that was used in films. It was very, oh yes, very good. Oh dear. It was very, there was a way of speaking, and even, British actors who made it to America took this very strange accent with them and then blended it with them. I mean, you think of someone like Cary Grant, or you think of this very peculiar accent that some of them had, which was this blend, almost no accent whatsoever. And I think over the years, it's been such a struggle, I think, to get, from that point to Train Spotting. It's kind of that journey, um, has been a long, difficult one, where I'm sure, even people in the UK would need subtitles for a lot of things that are going on in Train Spotting.
Yeah.
But it's a reality, that is a fair representation, that is how people actually speak.
Well, yeah, and then you got even more layers there. That's in Scotland. They have there's 30 different Scottish accents, and yeah, yeah,
Exactly.
and inner city culture versus working class. Like, yeah,
100%,
it's a
100%.
it's a
Yeah.
ball of interesting cultural stuff there, and if you look back, you're right, and you look back to like old Ealing comedies. Even those, a lot of those are really about class, and
About
everybody
100%.
has that same clipped, transatlantic upper accent, weird accent, and it's
It
so
is. I mean,
bizarre.
I think, as I say, if you go through, decade by decade in terms of British cinema from the 20s, the four, but you've got a cinema that's trying to represent and looking for, post-war, trying to find a sense of its own identity as well, and also to some extent you could argue, trying to not reinstate class, that's the wrong way of putting it, but laying out, the parameters once more, because the great leveler of class was the war, the Second World War, when, it really didn't matter, of course, who your parents were. Uh, um, people were dying, at every rank, so to speak, in military and in the country itself. Um, but it's a very, again, another one, very, very, very complicated.
So, we answered a ton of questions in that
I
one
don't even, I know,
one
I'm sorry here. Right?
no, this is
Let's get
great,
back to
like,
Harry Potter. Harry Potter's the best one.
it's very clear I'm already gonna have to have you on again to talk about more of this subject because we're not even scratching the surface. Let's connect to British literature. So British cinema has a deep relationship with literature. So
Yes.
adapting novels and plays and stories that carry the weight of national culture. Is that literary inheritance a strength, or do you think it might hold British film back from developing its own cinematic language like we have here in the US?
I think it. I think it can. I mean, I think that the heritage of, um, the Great Brit. I always think of Jane Eyre, of course. The continual, um, same stories being told time and time again. I think can be problematic for British film. Be that, even Robin Hood, I know that's maybe not a classic novel, but it's the idea of certain kinds of stories, being being retold and remade and on repeat. And invariably, to go back to the thing we talked about previously, that these, these kinds of films will invariably being funded from, Hollywood. And it can, reduce British cinema, new voices, new stories, things that need to be told, even more contemporary, uh, uh, um, perspectives on British culture, rather than, keep going back to um, narratives that are about 18th century. And, it can get, from a British perspective, it can get very tiresome. And maybe that's why some of them don't do that well, um, in the UK. But then something like Downton Abbey is immensely popular in the UK. But in terms of the literature itself, we could go all the way back to Shakespeare, can't we? Is these things being retold and 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 remade time and time and time again, for different audiences. Uh, I mean, my perspective on it is it's tiresome, and I think it can reduce British cinema, the potency of it. But then at the same time, you have to balance that. These things are popular for a reason, and they find their audience, in ways. And if you can find your audience with these stories being retold, be it Wuthering Heights, whatever it may be, it brings money, and maybe it allows, for other smaller stories to be told. So you've got to, I'm not a advocate of, we shouldn't be doing this, and the British film industry shouldn't be churning these things out. I think if as long as the money that comes in is then filtered in a way that allows some smaller filmmakers, the time and the money to make their films, and I think, to an extent, through various channels, be it Film 4, even the BBC, have managed to filter money, to very singular voices in cinema that have gone on to become, world beat Danny Boyle, or, they've managed to filter money to filmmakers who've been able to tell their stories, that have been reached an audience beyond the UK.
So it makes you wonder what your thoughts are on the new Wuthering Heights film.
They're not good, I can tell you that. They're not good at all. I did. I mean, I'll be honest. I mean, I thought it was absolutely atrocious. I really
Uh,
did. I thought it was
uh,
awful from beginning
I
to end.
Both Mrs. Anglotopia and I hated it,
Yeah.
and I've seen every
Why?
adaptation of
Why
Wuthering
did you
Heights.
hate it so much?
Uh, the thing is I love Saltburn, so it's not. I don't think it's the
Sa-
director's.
Same here. Yeah.
Yeah, because that's a great exploration of class.
Yeah.
I don't like Wuthering Heights looks great, but the way the story was told, I just think it didn't do the story any justice, and it was hard to get through, and I mean,
Yes.
by, like, an hour, I'm, like, looking at my phone, like, this isn't
100%. Yeah.
this has not held my attention, and but it's a shame because the cast is great. I mean, even Martin Clunes, like, is fantastic in it. He shows range he never showed in Doc Martin, and and yet, like, it's like the all the ingredients were there for a great period drama. Somehow, the soup didn't turn out. I
No, it didn't, and it's really difficult. I mean, I think it's difficult to put your finger on, but I think if you're going in with the weight of other movies as well, I think sometimes, I always try and balance that a little bit when I'm, if I'm thinking this is dreadful, but then who's it made for? Is it made for? Is that made for a kind of, well, obviously, I mean, I think it's made for a much younger audience who are not going in with with all these, what I would call, I mean, I'll call it cultural cargo, that you kind of carry into movies, all the other movies you've seen, and all, uh, um, and is it made for people of a particular vintage, as I would say, or is it, are they trying, is that one? But that one I didn't understand because I wasn't sure who it was made for. I was like, really? Is this made for like 19-year-olds? Because I don't get it.
Yeah, and that's I mean, that takes me back to my academic days, and the number one question um, that my professors would always have us ask when we're analyzing something is
Mm,
who is this for?
exactly.
And if you can easily identify who something is for, then you can appreciate something in a way, even if you didn't like it. And I think by the end of Wuthering Heights, I was like, like you said, who is this for?
I don't know.
I don't I'm maybe I'm at 42, I'm too old to get the younger generations, but even if I made my teenagers watch it, I don't think they would have liked it. So I
No, I don't. It's just, I mean, I'll watch it and I'll think, you cannot beat, Laurence Olivier. For me, the 1930s one, just the look of it, the feel of it, the black and white, that to me is Wuthering Heights for me. I know for other people it's probably a more contemporary one, but for me, that's it. And so I watch, I think, oh, it's never gonna, but it's that which is the most important thing. I think we touched on it before, is understanding, who is this film for? Why has it been made, and who is this trying to connect with? And that's why even other, films that are about British culture, that are big budget, got big, so I haven't got huge problems with them because you can see what they're trying to do, even if the representation of British culture is problematic. But something like Wuthering Heights, I just don't. I didn't even feel British to me. So to me, I don't know what it felt like.
well, what's frustrating is my one of my biggest criticisms of modern film, and especially in the streaming age, is that movies have no texture anymore.
Yeah,
They're all flatly lit, there's no grain because everything's
no,
digitally shot, and so
yeah,
this
yeah,
movie had texture and grain, and I was like,
yeah,
"This is great."
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
enjoying that looking at this,
yeah,
but
yeah.
man, am I not enjoying anything else in this movie.
No, no, it's a really strange one. It's a really strange film for me. I can't put it into words. Really, I don't know why. Nothing clicked with me at all with that film.
So, again, we got off topic talking
We
about Wuthering
did
Heights,
anyway. Yes, we
but
did.
it's a great segue into my next question about landscape. So, the British landscape has always kind of been a character in British
Yes,
film, and I know for me, that's one of the things that has made me
yes,
love Britain so much is the landscape. So, the Yorkshire moor, the London street, the hills of the West Country, the crumbling country
sure.
houses.
Yeah.
So, how does place function in British cinema in a way that's different from Hollywood? Because Hollywood will make up the place or they'll just create an approximation of the place. But when you film something in Britain, you usually get the place.
Yes. I think place and space in in representations of Britain in film and British cinema, it's a character in and of itself. But I also believe that that is a sentiment. I think for British people in general, I think a deep pride in their in their um in their area, permeates everything, be it you go into, sport and football and, the way in which people have a connection with their where they were born, even if they've moved away. Um, and that can be, the sprawling landscapes of the Cotswolds, or it can be like me, a harsh industrial. I'm still deeply proud of that, and people are. If you speak to people in Liverpool, they will talk about the docks and the, like it's a paradise, and I think there's a real deep pride in 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 the area, in the look of it, and I think that in terms of film, there's a real, I think, when things are shot here, I mean, I could be wrong. We talked, briefly about whether it's a British film depends on who's behind the cameras. I think there's such pride in, location managers and, production designers who are from the UK, if they've got to make something in the UK, to get it authentic, to get it feeling right, to get it looking right. And it plays an absolutely enormous, part of British culture. And I think in terms of British film, that heritage part, of listed buildings and things being preserved. And I'm not just talking about castles. It can be a giant metal pump that's by us is listed. You cannot touch it. It's because it's part of this local heritage. And it's fascinating to see that played out, be it in, I mean, because where I'm from, is where they filmed Peaky Blinders, and it's just up the road. They're filming the new series of it, and it's people are watching it, looking for that. Is this accurate? Have they got that right? You can't turn the street into there because it would take it. It's that kind of micro level of criticism, and I think that reflects itself in not all, of course, but that you see it in films that are made in the UK. That are about very particular cultural touchstones of Britain. But I think it plays an enormous role in British cinema. And maybe that is, I couldn't say, but maybe again, that is something that for a lot of great British films that have appealed to international audiences, that it is precisely that kind of feel, from these films that makes people look at British film and as distinctly British. That's it. I can't say that because I'm too biased or I'm too involved in it, but I think there's something about it, definitely.
So, for my last question before we get into our favorites real quick before you have to go, why do you think Americans love British films so much? I'm interested to know what you think.
Oh, that's it. Well, it's the same. I was thinking about this. Obviously, we've just had the recent, King Charles visiting and
Yeah.
giving his speech in Congress. And there was something about that speech which I thought spoke volumes about British culture in general, in how understated it was, but how deeply critical and not offensive. Wasn't offensive in any way. There was something, in short, there was something so British about that speech where he completely undercut the president. He undercut political issues, but he did it in a way where nobody could quite
No one could get mad
call him
about it.
out for it.
Yeah.
It was like, wow, if ever there was a quintessential British thing, it would be that. It's that sarcasm. It is that is, and the self-deprecating nature, I think, of British culture in general. I think it varies depending where you are in the country, of course, but there's something incredibly self-deprecating about British culture, and even the icons of British culture, be James Bond. They're still kind of, there's something self-deprecating about them all the time. Even Harry Potter, Robin Hood. There's that level of not being afraid to laugh at yourself or see your own shortcomings, but also quite pointedly raise them to others, in a way that does not offend. And I think there's something, or may offend, but you go home and think about it later. And I think British film, I think even the subject material of British film is not afraid to, be very self-deprecating. We talked about humor, with Monty Python, the Full Monty. There's something about it where it's this complete ridicule of what it is to be British, and even to go to Merchant Ivory films that are deeply critical of the class structure, and and I think that appeals. And again, I'm not sure Hollywood film in general is always very good at doing that. It can be very, congratulatory. You're never going to see a British version of Top Gun, for example. It's just never going to happen.
Battle of Britain's a great film, though.
But yeah, but contemporary, I
Yeah.
mean, and I think even if you were to do a side by side with, the Battle of Britain or Dam Busters, and you put them opposite with, you shouldn't, because they're made in completely different moments, of course, but you look at them and there is something distinct, I think, distinctly different in terms of their representation of heroism as well.
I would say that King Charles's speech was a masterclass in threading the needle uh, carefully. It was great. I loved it. So I know you have to go. So we're gonna do something. We're gonna do a lightning round. Give me your top five British films in the way and what you would define as a British film.
Oh, now that is hard. I have, because you prepared me, you've pre-warned me of this. I've tried my best. Now, whether they're British films, we're going to have to do an
Yeah.
whole other podcast on whether, because you're probably like, what is that? I don't know. But I would go from the earliest would, for me, a film had a massive impact on me as a kid was Rebecca, the Alfred Hitchcock. You know, Wow, what a film. Kind of Wuthering Heights feel to it as well. I think they even remade that one. But the original, the direction of it scared me as a kid immensely. I don't know why, and it was everything I was scared of about the kind of aristocracy in one film. It was there. Rebecca would be a film. Here's a contentious one for you. Doctor No. Is that I don't know. It's a funny one, but to me,
Yeah.
quintessential Bond. I don't think you're going to get any better than that. My third one is a big passion of mine is Hammer horror films. So it's got to be The Devil Rides Out, 1960s, Christopher Lee and Charles Gray, who was in he was in Bond films as well, like the ultimate British villain. If you want to get a British villain, this guy, Charles Gray, that is it. And then for me, some of these films we've talked about, The Full Monty, loved that movie so much. Just its representation of class. The thing I love about that, and I'm going to shut up, sorry, but The Full Monty, I love that movie because it represents working class, not as bleak, downtrodden, kind of Kes, kind of Michael Lee, the working classes are all miserable. Is The Full Monty represents, misery, but there's joy in the misery. And then the only other one I've got is a more contemporary film, which is much bleaker, is a film called Dead Man's Shoes, which is a Shane Meadows film, who actually is from the Midlands. He made a film called Once Upon a Time in the Midlands. And if out of them all, it's a film I would urge anybody. It's very, very harrowing film, but it's just masterful. It's a film I've seen about 3 times. It's a film I show students because it touches on class, and it touches also upon, all kinds of things to do with 1980s and the downtrodden, and it's harrowing and awful, but a film had a massive impact on me. So that's mine. But what about yours? I want to know.
All right. I'll do it quickly. Well, my number one, which I mentioned already, is The Remains Today. I
Sure.
think
Yeah.
that to me, that film encapsulates Britain in so many ways.
Sure.
And my special interest area in British history is the
Yeah.
interwar period. So like
Yeah.
that that film to me. It's they're one of the
Fantastic.
few perfect films. My
Yeah.
next would be a major Hollywood production known as Master and Commander: The Far Side of the World.
Wow. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
That I mean, that movie is when I need a pick me up, I put that movie on. It's a perfect movie. Like, yeah, big Hollywood budget, but
Oh, yeah,
and made by a New
brilliant. Yeah.
Zealander, but that movie is so British with the class system on the boat,
Mhm.
and the
Mhm,
boat
mhm.
is England. Like, I love that movie so
Yeah.
much. Next would be the movie About Time, a Richard Curtis movie. Um, that movie was mismarketed. It was marketed as a romantic comedy, but that's not what the movie's about. Um, I love that movie. It's a great New Year's Day movie because it takes place
Mhm.
at New Year's. So,
Mhm, mhm.
and then fourth is this is going to be out there for a lot of people. They may not even heard of this movie. It's called Tamara Drew,
No, I've
and
not heard of this. Yeah.
so it was made like 15 years ago, and to me, it's one of the best adaptations of Far From the Madding Crowd. It's a modern take on Far From the Madding Crowd, adapted from a graphic novel that was a modern
Wow.
take on it, and it's got
Okay.
a great British cast in it, and it's to me it does class and the British countryside great, and it takes place in Dorset, which is my favorite place. Um, I'm going to go over five. That Hamilton Woman is a great historical epic.
Mhm.
Winston
Yeah.
Churchill's favorite movie,
Yeah. Yeah.
but a great character exploration of the
Mhm.
Napoleonic Wars.
Mhm.
Um, and then the movie Hot Fuzz, which is a
That's
parody, a
yeah, yeah,
satire of
yeah.
the
Yeah.
Hollywood movies,
Yes, 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 yes.
but with the English twist and a small
Yeah.
English village. It's perfection.
Yes.
Um, and then, On Chesil Beach, to me,
Right, yeah.
is a great exploration of 1960s Britain. And then I've done more than 5, but I will also say all of the Wallace and Gromit shorts. Are they
I bet
films?
I
Well,
mean,
they're
yeah.
shorts, but I
Yes, yes,
mean,
yes, yes, yes.
they
I
each
mean, my son, he is such an enormous Wallace and Gromit fan. It's not even worth saying. They are amazing. They are amazing.
every single one of them is perfect,
Yes.
and even the one they made with Hollywood Money is
Yeah,
perfect,
yeah.
and those are infused with British visual language, British culture, British class,
Believable. Yeah.
and claymation animation where you don't expect it. They're
No,
perfect.
it's
So
so true. It is those films, as I say, if you want to think about, you know, the different regions of the UK, then if you watch that, you are seeing a very particular, you know, area of the country and attitude and, you know, yeah, the Wallace and Gromit are, you know, and you can tell that I think you can always tell if if movies do it really, really well, like the Wallace and Gromit, is because people in Britain will cherish it. And so, you know, Wallace and Gromit, you know, we've even got like a dark ride at Blackpool of Wallace and Gromit, you know, which is amazing, by the way. Um, you know, so it's so loved, you know, because I think it nails it in such a way.
yeah, and it reminds me back in 2011, I went to the royal wedding to cover the Prince William and Catherine royal
Sure.
wedding.
Yeah.
And, I went to the pub afterwards with my colleague who covered it with me,
Yeah.
and they replayed the whole wedding while we had a nice pub lunch, and then you know what came on right after the coverage of the royal wedding?
What
They
was it?
played Wallace and Gromit, which was on BBC One, which is the perfect way to the perfect
I think
chaser to all that
it is.
Britishness.
That's about it is. Yeah, that's the perfect, yeah, almost antidote, isn't it, to it
Yeah.
all? Yeah, to the pomp and ceremony. Is then what's that? Yeah, it's no. That, I mean, what a fan! I'm ashamed of my list now. I mean, my goodness me, what great films there! I know. I was just saying, I'm ashamed of my list now. When you reel off these, they're amazing. Yeah, I agree. I'll change mine now. Yeah, I'll go with those. I like that. Wallace and Gromit. Yeah.
Well, we could do a whole episode on lists of British films, so
Oh, 100% you could.
I'm conscious that you have to go, so
I'm so sorry. And I could talk, you know, I think we could talk about this for hours. We really
we're
could.
gonna have to have you on again. So
I'd
what a
love to.
wonderful What a wonderful conversation this has been. What a rich subject to get into. Thank you so much for joining us on the Anglotopia podcast, Spencer. If you've been inspired to dig deeper into British cinema, we'll put some recommendations and resources in the show notes, like the BFI Top 100 British Films. And if you have your own favorite British films, the ones that first made you love Britain or the ones you keep coming back to, please share them in the comments on YouTube, Instagram, or Facebook. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this episode of the podcast, please subscribe, like, or comment. And if you like the Anglotopia podcast, please consider joining the Friends of Anglotopia Club, where you get early access to new episodes and connect with other enthusiasts about Britain. So join us next time as we continue exploring the people, places, and stories that make Britain's cultural heritage so endlessly fascinating to discover. Thank you again, Spencer.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.